Welcome. In this demonstration, we will draw a path leading into the woods. So, in a lot of other demonstrations, for example, this one, what we have done is to kind of, take a bit of point of view where we're looking from top, a bit, top down in our scene. So essentially, whenever you draw a landscape, there's a point of view you take in terms of, what angle you are kind of looking at the scene from. And in most of our demonstrations, we take the look at a bit of, a bit high up, and then, we are able to see that, the receding words or other elements, that we have in our composition. What we will do in this demonstration is to take a bit different point of view. So essentially, what we will do is to get to the ground level, and then we will have a ground view of, going into the forest or woods, so that kind of, point of view we will have in this demonstration. So let's start by putting down this line, and this essentially is kind of where we will draw the trees, and then we will have so let me just put a dotted line, a kind of path going into the wood, something like this, right? So this is essentially a different point of view that goes down to the ground and looks straight up, something, a point of view that you will have, for example, if you were to kind of look at some of the trees in the distance and that you're walking into it. Right, so that's more like a ground point of view. But in most of other landscape, we have taken different point of views. So one good thing is that whenever you're doing any drawing, try to have a different point of views. That makes your drawing interesting. So let's start by putting down some of these tree trunks in our drawing. So we'll start by putting down these tree trunks over here. And what I always like to do is to have tree trunks that are a bit far apart so that we can draw the foliage. So essentially, the thing to always keep in mind is to draw the foliage and the trees that are up front, close to the viewer, so that you have the space that will be taken up by them drawn, and then what the space is available to draw for the other elements, other trees that are behind. So let me start by putting down these three trees that are closest to that are in front, so their foliage will essentially be in front, and it will hide anything that is behind them. And then I can put one more tree over here like this. So let's start by actually shading the trunk and the foliage for these trees, and then we will see what other space we have essentially for our other trees that are behind. But the overall composition that we have in this drawing is essentially that you're looking, that you're standing on the ground, and then you're looking into the woods, and then you will have a kind of nice perspective, where the trees will reduce in size, and then you'll have a nice sense of distance that you will travel. So what I do essentially is to lay down my first few trunks that are closest to the viewer, and then I will use this kind of wiggly line that we have seen before for shading these trunks. So these are a bit bigger trunks because they're closer to the viewer, so I have some space to provide some kind of texture to the bark, and I use these wiggly lines that we have seen in a lot of other demonstrations to create a kind of quick feel of bark for the trunk. And again, I darken one end, right? So essentially you always have to have this kind of total variation from dark to light to bring out the roundness that we have seen in other demonstrations. So I use the same stroke, just more of it, to kind of darken one end. So there we have it, right? Very quickly I'm able to put down the bark texture for this trunk. And what I will do is to use these parallel lines that we have seen in other demonstrations to essentially define the foliage for the trees in this demonstration. So I'll just start again using, and I also put down a bit of outline. So it's always good to use a dotted line. So never use a hard line like this for the edges, because if you use a hard line like this, then that will take away the effect of the foliage. So you always want to have a bit of open airy feel for the foliage. So you want, you just put down anything at the edges in dotted lines, so that doesn't create a hard effect. So that's what I've done. So this way I have a good understanding of the kind of overall shape of the tree foliage that I want, so something like this. And then I start to use my parallel line. So we have seen the use of this stroke to do the tree foliage in many of the demonstrations. So essentially what you do is you just put down one line of one parallel line, and then you start adding other more lines like this. So what I'm doing is essentially I'm kind of creating a bit of darkness in this shape like this. And what this is doing, so again, if I add one more layer over here, and then I add one more layer over here, so what this is now doing is giving us a sense of volume. Because now this this dark area and having a light in between, this is giving us a sense of volume for the foliage. So this is the technique that we have used in a lot of other demonstrations, and then we will use over here as well. So I keep adding my parallel lines, and creating some darker areas by using more of the lines. So as you have more lines overlapping on each other, it creates darker area because essentially you have more lines over there. So that's what I will do. I will simply go ahead and add a bit more lines like this. This is a real fun way to essentially draw the foliage for trees. So you essentially add these parallel lines, and what you do is always remember to add them in a manner like this. So we go ahead and add something like this. So do not add in a straight line, or but the darkness should be something like in this rounded manner, So because that is how the foliage, that's a typical shape of a foliage. So when you add in a darkness like this, this indicator there's a bit thicker foliage over here, there's a lighter over here, so that gives a nice sense of volume. So these dark shapes, they correspond with the kind of feel we have for the foliage, the shape of foliage. So always add them in in shapes like this. So that's what I'm doing over here. So I quickly add bit of line over here, bit of line over there. And what I also like to do is to essentially have this top right area a bit lighter and darken this area bottom left a bit more. So there is light, this area is lighter and this area is a bit darker. So that also gives a bit more sense of volume, because that kind of indicates that there's a sun coming from here. So this area is darker over here, this is lighter. So that also adds to the overall feel of volume for the foliage. So essentially, when we draw a foliage, what we want to achieve are two things. One is to have an overall nice feel, and secondly, to also make it a bit more realistic, we also want to give it a nice sense of volume. So essentially, we want to indicate that there are different layers, and and that there is a nice sense of volume. So this kind of dark and light areas, they help us achieve that sense of volume. So now you can see that it doesn't feel flat. So even though this area is kind of this is a paper, but the way you achieve volume is by having these different tones that kind of mimic the way the different forms are in that element. So over here we are using these different areas of darkness and lightness, something like this, and then I add one more here. So this one and this one, this is indicating that there is different layers of foliage. So that's what we are doing over here. So that's where there we have it, right? And then what I will do at the edges is to again quickly add some things like this, because you want to give an open airy feel. And sometimes when you use these parallel lines, you can create a bit of hard edge. So so you have to take away that hard edge to give it a nice feel of foliage. And you can even go ahead and add a bit of this dots even in the body of the foliage over here, but usually just add it to the edges or something like this over here, and this gives us a nice open airy feel for the foliage. And I will do something similar for this tree trunk over here as well. So let me just darken it, and then I will use the same wiggly lines over here to draw its bark texture. And again I will darken one and more to again bring out its volume. And then again what we also do, as we have seen in the demonstration, is to add a bit of jaggedness to the edges. So that jaggedness also helps to kind of give a nice feel for the roughness of the bark and a feel for the texture of the bark. So there we have it, right? So I quickly just added, and again I added a bit more lines to one end to darken it, so that also brings out the kind of roundness. And what I will do is again to kind of create a initial outline using the dotted line. And again always use kind of organic shapes for your overall foliage. So this is like an organic shape, so do not go for it something like this or even something like this, but kind of a bit organic shapes. So once I have it again in the dotted line, I will go ahead and start using my parallel lines again to kind of give it foliage. So again I draw one line, and then I draw a second layer above it, and again see the shape that I'm following. This is the kind of shape that gives a nice feel of foliage. So something like this is a bit curved shape. And what I do is I add bit over here, bit over there. So again what I'm mimicking is the different layers of foliage. So what I also do in the end, in the edges, is to have a small, and then I use a bigger shading in the center. So let me go ahead and add a bit more over here. So again you can see that this gives a one layer feel for one layer, and when I add one more layer like this, now this gives us a sense of volume, because there is a lighter and there's a darker. So that's how just by adding these different layers in these shapes. So essentially I'm adding different layers in this shape like this, and that is kind of helping us give a nice feel of layers of foliage, and that is giving us a sense of nice sense of volume for our foliage over here. So always remember, do not draw these parallel lines in this shape. Always draw this circular like this, and that is kind of how you get a nice sense of volume. So I'll go ahead and add a bit more over here like this, something like this. And again once you get a nice hang of it, you'll automatically instinctively do add these kind of shapes in these parallel lines in this shape, something like this, something like this. And then you also use different sizes. So I have one big patch around about here, so this is a big foliage mass, and then I have smaller ones in the edges. So as you go at the edges, use smaller sizes, and leave the bigger one towards the center. That's what I've done over here. I will add a bit more over here, bit more over here, something like this. And then you can always at the end, when you're done with the overall drawing, you can adjust their tones as well. So do not add too much dark, because in drawing it's the balance that matters the most, right? So the dark that you have is always relative in your drawing compared to the different elements. So I don't like to darken it too much in the beginning. So I just add enough of the dark to bring out the volume. But again what we will do in the end is to adjust those darks and light tones to have an overall balance in our drawing. So there we have it, right? So I just added quickly foliage for this tree as well. And as you can see, our point of view is kind of more towards the ground, looking straight in. So we're not looking from top down that we have seen in other demonstrations. So once we have done this, what now we can do is to start to add other foliage as well, other trees. And the thing is, you have drawn the two trees that will hide other foliage behind it. So once we have that in place, what I can do, I can start to add in a bit of trees that are a bit further behind, bit further out. So here's one trunk I quickly drew. And what I'm doing for this, as we have seen, is that if your trunk gets smaller, so they will get smaller with distance, what you do over here is to just add a bit of jagged darkness, something like this, to bring out the volume of that trunk. So we don't have space to essentially use these kind of strokes. We have used these angular lines in some other demonstrations, but as the size of the trunk gets smaller, we just simply add a bit of jagged darkness to one edge to give it a feel of volume. So that's what I just did over here. And what I will do next is to again have a kind of feel of outline for the foliage of this tree. So that's what I just did over here. And now, as you can see, the bit of portion of this tree is hidden behind this tree in the front. So it's always good to start with the trees in the front. So now we have an understanding of what will show through for the trees that are behind. And then I again start using these parallel lines. And the other thing I always try to do is to also leave a bit of layer of separation between the different foliage. So for example, we do not want to, so when I'm doing this foliage, what I will do is leave a layer of white around about here, so that the different foliage, they will appear distinct and they will not merge into each other. So that's what I'm doing over here, right? So, and I will also add a bit of darkness near this edge. So essentially what you want is a kind of contrast at the edge of the front foliage and the back foliage. And the way I usually do it is to leave the front foliage a little bit whiter at the edges, and then add a bit more darkness to the foliage that is behind it, something like this. So now you can see that there's a clear separation between the two foliage, and they're not merging into each other, and we have a nice sense of the fact that there is a nice layer of separation. So this is, try to leave this bit layer of white, so leave the foliage, the front foliage a little bit whiter at the edges, and you can make the back foliage a bit darker at the edges, so that will create that nice separation between the two. So there we have it. So I just quickly put down that foliage, and then I will add one more trunk over here, and essentially draw its foliage something like this. Then you can also draw the different size of foliage. Some trees are tall, they have height, and some trees are a bit shorter, a bit more rounded. So essentially use different shapes to create a nice interest in your drawing. So let me again create this bark texture by just using this jagged darkness, something similar. So that's what we will do for the trunks as they get smaller with the distance. And I again use these parallel lines to quickly add a kind of foliage. And what I will do is something similar that we did before. Is now, since this side is a bit darker, because I like to keep my bottom left a bit darker for the foliage, I will leave this foliage a bit white over here. So you have to decide which will be whiter and which will be darker. And essentially the thing to keep in mind is don't make both this front and the back foliage dark at this point, because then they will start to merge into each other, and then they will not have that visual separation, right? So because the front foliage is dark, I will leave the bottom a bit lighter over here, something like this, and then I will darken the back, this area, a bit more, so something like this. So now you can see that there is again a visual separation between this front foliage and the back foliage, again something like this. So this is how you essentially gonna create a separation between the different elements, because we don't have colors, right? So normally if you're using color, then you can use different shades of green or what have you to create that separation. But because you don't have that option here, you try to leave a layer of white, or you use a different tones where the elements kind of merge into each other to create that separations. And I will again add a bit more further out, right? So the other thing I want to also do is to have these trees at different distances, and that the distance determines their depth as well, right? So what I'm done is this is closest to the viewer because it is further down. So the more a trunk goes down over here, the more it gets closer to the viewer. So this is the closest, and then this trunk is a bit further out, and then this is even further out. So thing is, and I don't want to put them in a plane like this, right? So I just extend this a bit, and now this tree is further behind, and then I can even move this tree a bit more as well. So I always try to put these different trunks in different distances from the viewer, because that adds more interest. And then I will further just use the dotted line. So this this foliage will even be smaller, right? Because this is even further out in the distance. And then again, I'm trying to leave a white here just to again give it a nice visual separation. So there we have it, right? So this is how quickly you can put down that foliage as well. And then again, what I will do is define one more. So I will bring down this trunk a bit, because I don't want, so I have this line, this line in pencil I put down a bit to indicate the kind of ground line. So then I can have different distances for the trunks with respect to that line. So I bring this trunk a bit down so that it is more closer to the viewer, and now I can have this trunk further out, something like this. Then again add a jagged darkness to give some volume to the trunk, and then further again I will just add a bit of dots to just outline its foliage, and again I will use that same parallel lines to give a nice hint of suggestion of the foliage for that tree in the distance. And there we have it. And again you can see that I left a layer of white right there, right? So the thing is that our eyes they ignore that white essentially, in a sense that they are not really visible when we are kind of taking in the scene. So but they do provide us with a nice separation of the different layers, so that that helps us in that regard, something like this. So there we have it. And so now it's looking nice. We have a tree in the front, and other further trees going out in the distance, and therefore their size reducing with the distance. And what I can do is again add few more trees over here, and then again I will add its foliage, something like this, and then here we have it. So this is the drawing we are doing, and this is very fun drawing because you get a nice sense of distance, and you also get a sense of walking through the woods. Here we have it. And if you want, you can all make a different compositions on this theme. So essentially you can have, so my path is quite wide, but if you want you can even have a lot more trees over here and make the path a bit narrower, so you can always kind of play on that. So I have one here, and so yeah, so if you want we can add one more over here, right? So we kind of make a bit more, and have a bit closer. So one more tree over here, and if I want I can even add one more tree over here. And as you can see, you have to reduce them in size as they're going further out in distance. You try to reduce them in size, and again this and this, they are in the same line, which I don't like, so I will again try to move this down a bit over here, something like this. So again there's at least these two planes, they seem to be in a different kind of distance. And then I will again add a bit of foliage over here, something like this. So now this is looking good, and if you want you can even add some more trees over here, but I think just I will have this kind of scene for this drawing. So as you can see now, this is giving a great sense of distance, right? That this tree foliage reducing in size, it really gives a nice sense of distance. And this over here I'm not really making it very thick wooded. You can do that as well. So in that case, you just drop more trees kind of close up, right? So depending on how your trees are reducing in distance, that gives the corresponding depth to the drawing. And what I can do over here is I can again add one more tree over here, and then add some kind of foliage here as well. There you have it. So as you can notice, I'm trying to kind of leave a bit of wide between all these different foliages, so that there is a nice separation, and then we get a feel for all the different trees and their foliage, right? So that's what I'm doing. So there's a layer of white over here, there's a bit of white that you can notice. So all the trees, they have a distinct presence in the drawing. And then I will again add one more tree over here, something like this. And then I will define its foliage again and shade it. So again, this is a different point of view. This is more close to the ground point of view than some other compositions that we have seen. So essentially, the different point of view. So essentially, whenever you're starting your composition, you have to decide what will be your point of view, and then based on that, then kind of lay out your different elements. So if you're looking at a bit more from the top, then you'll have a different view that we have seen in other demonstrations. In this we have a view closer to the ground, and which is why we are seeing this kind of receding trees. So I will again go ahead and add a bit of more foliage to this as well, right here. And again the technique is the same. You add in a bit of parallel lines and give it different layers so that it acquires a nice sense of volume. There we have it. And then if I want, I can also add a bit more trees over here, something like this that we have done. And again I will add this jagged darkness to define the trunk, and just bare outline of the foliage, and shading to bring it out. So this is why this parallel line shading is great, because this is great for doing quick sketches. This is great for just putting down a nice scene like this. So as you can see, if we use this kind of scribbly stroke or the leaf stroke that we have seen the demonstration for the foliage, that takes up more time. But for trees that are far out in the distance, this is a great parallel line. This approach is a great way to just quickly render some of the tree foliage and get a nice sense in your drawing. And again I will add one more. So again, adding the small trees, over here gives a real sense of depth, and that really makes a drawing very interesting. That's what I always like to do. So even if you have a small space, add one over there. So now we have great sense of depth, because we have these trees that are much smaller in size, and giving that sense of distance in our drawing. And there we have it. Right now at this point, if I want, I can even add one more small tree over here. But yeah, this is something that you can play with, right? So the whole general idea is that you create two big trees in the front, and then you start to add trees a bit in the distance, something like this. So this is biggest, this is a bit smaller, this is for the smaller, and you kind of kind of overlap them a bit, so that it gives a sense of nice dense wooded area. And what I've not done is actually I've left a lot of white in between. If you want, you can add more trees over here, right? So that's something that you can do. But I think what I will do is to add some kind of distant tree line over here. So I think I will just use that parallel line to add a bit of distant tree line over here. But again, what you can also do is to add more trees, so that you can have this whole kind of area covered with trees as well. But I will just add this tree over here, and then what we can do is to essentially had some kind of distant thing in the backdrop. So as I've described, I always like to have some thing where the eyes can rest. So the viewers, they will travel this scene, so they will look at this path and their eyes will travel. So what we want is something in the distance where the eyes can rest. So that can be a distant tree line, a foliage, or even a mountain that we have seen in a lot of other demonstrations. So what I will do is to just keep it simple over here and just use a kind of a tree line, right? So the tree line that you can do is simply by using these parallel lines. And again, you have to keep in mind that this is your tree, and these are the distant trees as well. So the tree line will be smaller than this tree size. So you cannot make a tree line big, because then that will be odd, because your trees are this size, and this tree line is even further out, right? So this the height of this tree line that determines the height of the trees essentially should be the smallest, right? So that's why I'm making them very small, something like this over here. So there we have it, a small tree line where the eyes can rest, as they go out. So I really like this tree line because that provides a nice resting spot, especially if you have a wooded area, right? And you want to have some kind of a bit of feel for some distant woods. So this just parallel lines like this, and I always try to make the shape a bit organic, something like this, right? So that's what I've done, and it provides a nice feel for our this kind of bit of patch of trees over here, and then I will add bit over here. So like I said, again, you can make it even more dense by adding more trees. But what I did in this drawing is essentially add these a nice set of trees that are receding in distance, so that they gives a nice sense of perspective and depth. And then in the distance we have a kind of tree line where the eyes can rest. So there we have it, and then I will add a bit more over here and a bit more, something like this. So now this is this is giving a nice sense of perspective and depth, and also something where our eyes can wander and rest. And what I will do essentially is to, in the end, I will just kind of highlight the path and provide some kind of ground cover over here. So for the path, what I've done in other demonstrations is to draw this kind of line. So that what this does is it lets the viewer travel the path. So it kind of provides a nice kind of visual indication of a path. And what we're also doing is to kind of make this line halfway. So the length of this line is essentially kind of halfway between the path, and so it reduces in size. So we have seen that when you're a path, it will because of perspective always reduce in size with the distance. So that's what we did over here. And this line is essentially half this half the size of the width of path, and this line essentially gives a nice visual indication and kind of highlights the path in the drawing. So that's something nice, and then I like to do that. So once we have this, then lastly what we will do is to essentially ground these trunks and have some kind of ground cover. And we have seen in other demonstrations that that the kind of grass stroke is a very generic all-purpose stroke to essentially ground the trunks and provide some kind of ground cover. So that's what we will do. So I'll start by adding a bit of this kind of grass stroke, something like this, and essentially just ground the trunk over here, something like this. So yeah, you can see that grounding, this adding a bit of dark at the base of the trunk really grounds them and really makes the drawing much more polished. So always try to ground your trunk, because this trunk, when it's not grounded, it just looks a bit odd, right? But what you can do just by adding a bit of darkness and having some indication of a bit of darker spots at the base. So essentially these darker spots indicate some kind of grass, so now you have feel for grass or some kind of foliage at the base of the trunk that serves to ground it. So right now we don't really have that foliage, but the moment I start adding a bit of this grass, now you start to get a sense of foliage at the base of the trunk, and the moment you have that sense, this trunk appears grounded. So there we have it. So we will do something similar for all other trunks as well, just to ground them. And even for the distant tree, you don't really have space, you can just use dot, something like this, just use dot. So we have seen that as you go out in the distance, you have to use a smaller stroke, something like this, and at very far out distance you can just use a bit of dot, something like this, to have some indication of ground cover. And I will use this kind of bit small grass stroke for this trunk as well, and just to ground it like this. And the same, just I'll use a very small. So thing is, you have to always keep all the elements in perspective. So essentially, over here I cannot use a big stroke. I cannot use stroke like this for the grass, because this is far out in the distance, so the grass has to be very, very small, right? So over here I just again use a bit of dots just to indicate some kind of ground cover or grass or what have you. But as we get closer over here, now I can use a bit bigger strokes, because this is a bit closer. So as you can see, the size of the trunk that indicates the distance, and the size of the grass will also be in relation to the overall size of that element. So I do that, and here you're just adding a bit of grass, grounds this as well, and a bit over here and a bit over here. So there we have it, so, and finally, our ground is also looking a bit bare. So, and what I've done in other demonstrations is to essentially draw this ground line, something like this, on which we can draw a bit of grass cover to essentially have a nice ground cover. And this line, define the ground form. So they're essentially telling us the shape of the grounds. In this case it is flat, but if you have we have seen in the demonstration that when you have a angle plane like this, then you can use lines at an angle to essentially indicate the orientation of the ground of that plane. So here we will just use this flat lines over here, but again you can use a different set of lines. So essentially here, I can just add one over here, and you can even leave a bit of white over there. So that also kind of creates a kind of small path in the woods as well. Something like this, something like this, and something like this. And then what you can do is to then add a bit of grass to these lines. So something again use this stroke, something like this, right? So again these are not parallel lines, but these are a little bit curved lines like this. So create a clump of grass, something like this, to create a nice sense of ground cover. So I will just quickly add that, something like this, right? So I'm just adding a bit of line over here. So what happens is that the moment you add some kind of texture to the ground, using these small lines, the ground feels as if it is kind of a ground covered with something, and it brings out a nice feel in your drawing, right? Because when you're doing a landscape, there's always a bit of things on the ground, right? It is never kind of just empty. So over here this is also not too bad, in the sense that we still have some feel for the ground, but still we want to have so for example over here, if I just add a bit of something like this over here, so now this makes it a bit more interesting. So even just by adding bit small lines, so this is quite very amazing thing about pen and ink, is just by using a few line here, a few line there, just suggesting there's something on the ground like this, it makes that ground more interesting. At least I find it more interesting. So let me add a few more ground cover over here. And what we can also do is to leave a bit of white like this over here. So you can also leave a bit of white like this on the ground, and that kind of also indicates some kind of a path as well. So you don't really have to create the ground form everywhere, sorry, these ground lines, but you can even have a bit of ground line here, a bit here, and then there's a white in between. And what happens is that when you do the ground cover on this line and leave that white alone, that also gives a sense of kind of a worn out path. So essentially when you see that when people walk, the grass over there gets worn out, and then you have more a kind of path that gets developed. So that this gives a feel for something like that. So you can use that as well, right? So just draw a line, bit of lines here, bit of line there, and then leave a kind of path as well. So that's what we'll do. So I'll leave this path and not cover it with any kind of ground cover, and I will go ahead and add a bit more ground cover over here as well. Something like this. And as you can see, what I'm also doing is use a bit of bigger grass stroke as I get closer to the viewer. So again, you want to reinforce that notion of distance. So at the far out in the distance, I'm just using even very small lines or even just dots to have a sense of grass or some kind of ground cover in the distance. But as I get closer to the viewer, I can use a bit bigger stroke, something like this, over here. So now you can see that the grass, the size of the grass is decreasing as with the distance, and it is reinforcing that notion of distance. So something like this over here. And you can also cover the ground with white flowers and a stone, have small stone over here, a bit of bush, or so we have drawn a lot of other elements in our other drawings, so you can use all that to kind of add more interest. But what I wanted to show you here is how you can have a different point of view and draw a nice drawing where you have a sense of closer to the ground and looking out in the distance. So this is what we did, and over here I'll just have a quick ground cover. But yeah, you can always add more elements to the ground cover to make it more interesting, something like this. And finally I will just add a bit more here. So I'll leave this white spot again, that gives a nice sense of kind of a worn out path. So I'll just leave that white over here and just quickly something like this. And finally what I can also do is to add a bit more, just add dots over here to the base of this distant tree line. So again, when you have a distant tree line, something like this, you want to make the base a bit darker. That again, gives a bit more volume in a sense, because the top of the tree line will receive, sun and a bit lighter, and then just add a bit of darkness. So here this is very small, so just add a bit of dots even, right? So whenever you want to add a very small tone, just add a bit of dot here and there. So there we have it. So now we have a nice sense of, distant tree line, and these trees, they're going out in the distance, and this path going into the distance as well. And also, I have not made the path very small. Sometimes, you can even, have a path that goes out and then essentially merges, at a point. But what I've done is to leave a bit of width, so that indicates that this tree line is not very distant as such, that, that there's still some width for the path. Something like this. So there we have it, right? A very simple, but a nice drawing that we put together in under 20 minutes. I think it took us around 30 minutes, but yeah, essentially, so this is a different point of view, where you're looking, closer to the ground and looking out in the distance, and then you have trees, that are receding in distance and giving a nice sense of depth and perspective. Something nice and enjoyable that you can do anytime. Thanks. Take care. Bye bye.